Mike, thank you very much indeed. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I'm acutely aware that I'm keeping you from lunch, and therefore it's important that I try and make it both topical and interesting. I was talking to medical students yesterday in the second year in Birmingham, and that's quite a daunting prospect. There are just about 400 of them in each year now, so it's a huge audience. And they're terribly badly behaved. I have to say you've been very well behaved, but they talk to each other and they text each other and they eat, and they not uncommonly go to sleep, which you sort of get used to after a bit. There's a chap in the front row. I went to sleep fairly early on in the lecture, which is okay, and then started snoring. I have to say it's very, very off-putting trying to give a lecture when someone's snoring. So I said to the lady sat next door to me, I said, do you think you could wake him up? She looked me boldly in the eyes and said, you put him to sleep, you wake him up. So Mike has very kindly gone through the bits that I do. I do still work clinically. I don't do a huge amount of clinical work, but I have spent my career working in medical technology, mainly with small and medium enterprises. I set up my own medical device company many years ago and made quite a bit of money out of it. I then set up a second one and lost all of it, which I suppose is not a completely unusual story, really. And so that whole business about getting involved in it, even from actually owning your own company, I have some experience of. I just want to explain a couple of bits about the other roles that Mike talked about, because they won't necessarily be very clear to you what they involve. So the healthcare technology cooperatives are NIHR-funded bodies. There are 8 of them in the UK, and each one of them has a particular clinical area of interest, and ours is trauma. And we are funded to work with you as small, medium enterprises to bring your projects and your technology into healthcare. We each do something slightly differently. Now, I would admit to being slightly promiscuous when it comes to trauma, in that we take on a lot of things. If it's clearly in the field of another HTC, then of course we will refer you to them. But we do take on a lot of surgical interests, quite a lot of apps, quite a lot of other things, at lots of different stages. Our real interest is at the advanced prototype stage. I'll come back to that in a minute. And then working with you through the regulatory step, and then working through to get evidence into uptake into the NHS. We very recently just had funding from Europe, which is what the Medical Devices Testing and Evaluation Centre is all about. And Europe gave us a very large sum of money to build a dedicated simulation suite in Birmingham for the testing of medical devices. I can't actually find another one in the world. I've tried quite hard to find another dedicated simulation centre that's not used for clinical training, but is used for testing medical devices. The real attraction, and I apologise for a fairly hard sell, but the real attraction is that we can take devices at a very early stage of development. Our only requirement is that they plug into the mains, that they don't electrocute us. So we do pat test the equipment that comes in if it's plugged in. But it does not have to have gone through the regulatory pathway, because we're not using it on patients. Our patients are plastic. It's quite difficult to get them to consent or to object to having treatment, and therefore we can take your products, we can take 3D printed products, we can take products made out of non-clinically usable materials, and we can start working very early on to find out whether real clinical staff in a realistic environment can use your technology. We write a human factors usability report for you, so you can use that to support the development of your technology. And then I'll mention a little bit about NICE, a little about the other bits and pieces as I go through. Those of you in the sector will know this. What I think is particularly attractive about this meeting is that about a third to a half of the stands out there are in people that do things other than just medical devices. And that's very attractive for people like me, because I'm very keen to bring other people in other technology sectors into healthcare, because they have a lot to offer. There's a lot of people in my world who are trying to 3D print things that have no idea what they're doing. They're trying to connect pipes together and they've no idea what they're doing. And they seem reluctant to come and ask people that really do know how to do that. And so therefore I think to cross-pollinate between different sectors of both healthcare but also wider technology is very important. And so if you're in the sector, you will know this. There are over 500,000 recognised medical devices in the European market. 500,000. The majority of those are very straightforward pieces of equipment, like walking sticks, wheelchairs and so on, and they go on up. So of the 3 directives, the majority of them come under the main medical device directive. There's the active implantable medical device directive for pacemakers and so on, and then there's the in vitro diagnostic directive. And we work across all 3 of those directives. There are 29,500 medical device companies in Europe. 29,500 medical device companies in Europe. 99.6% are SMEs. The average number of employees in those medical device companies is 2. Their average bank balance is embarrassing. So it is a sector of the, I'm sorry, that sounds a bit rude, but it's a sector of the industry that is populated with vast numbers of small companies with very limited amounts of funding. And that's why the HTCs were introduced. They were very clearly introduced to support UK-based SMEs to make them more profitable, as well as bringing new technology into healthcare. But to do that, you have to get money for them. And so one of the things we've done in the 4 years, just over 4 years, we've been running the Trauma Management Health Technology Cooperative. We've worked with just under 100 SMEs in that 4 years. We signed 2 non-disclosure agreements a month, and we've raised £94 million in supporting mainly SMEs in bringing new technology to healthcare. And that's through grant awards, it's from charitable awards, and so on and so forth. So I appreciate it's an advert for the whole HTC program. And we will help you apply to Innovate UK, help you apply for SBI awards, help you apply to NIHR I4I, HTA, Research for Patient Benefit, and a whole range of other applications. And I think that's a useful service to supply to people. The other thing about technology is it's not going to go away. There are a relatively limited number of medicines, new medicines in the pipeline. I don't know how many, but not many. You could probably count them on the fingers of 2 hands. What there is, of course, and you'll have heard recently, is a whole interest in repurposing existing medicines because they appear to have a different action. That's very attractive to a pharma company because all of the safety information will have already been obtained. So they've already done all the safety studies. But technology is on the move. Of course it's on the move. We're using new things all the time. Everything we touch every day has changed. The way we use things has changed beyond all recognition. And as we get older, so we rely more and more heavily on technology. My children, I suspect, will have so many bits of their body replaced by the time they finally demise that they may not even look like what they started off like. So we're able to replace vast quantities of different bits of people at the moment. And our reliance on technology is undoubtedly increasing. So I'm going to cover just a few steps, and I'm going to go through it fairly quickly just to give you a feel for where the blockages in that step are. I'm going to talk a little bit about having ideas, about protecting them, producing prototypes, getting them into patient usage, particularly the regulatory step, and then the really complex and actually very expensive part of getting additional evidence to convince people to buy them. So without wanting to in any way suppress invention, we're not actually really often all that short of ideas. There are literally masses of people in universities, in industry and everything else with some extremely clever ideas. Quite a lot of it, there are ideas that overlap, and we clearly want to continue to encourage people to have ideas. The bit we really want to encourage you to do is to work out how that idea is actually going to get from the laboratory or from your workshops into healthcare. Now, you may not be able to do all of that yourself, but it's desperately important you understand that. Even quite early stage funding, so Ideas for Innovation funds advanced prototype through the regulatory step to first use in man. And it asks you, how are you going to commercialize it? You think, what's that got to do with you? You know, that's not what you're paying me to do. You're paying me to get it to first use in man. But they want you to have thought about that. They want you to have thought about, is it commercially viable? Do you understand the steps required to get support across the world from health technology assessment boards so that people actually buy it? So ideas, of course, are important, but we're very keen to encourage you to think of the pathway to adoption, even at a very early stage. I'm not an expert in protection. I think that it's a very complex area. You clearly need expert help. Probably one of the most important things is to find out whether you have freedom to operate in that area before you spend a lot of money designing something. What I would say, I'm a little bit cynical about all of this. The American medical device companies spend most of their time selling each other patent portfolios for things that don't work. It's an amazing idea. You can actually sell a patent portfolio for a huge sum of money with no evidence at all that what you've patented is actually of any use or works at all. I also have worked with at least half a dozen or more SMEs in the medtech centre who have bankrupted themselves through trying to support extensive IP portfolios. And I suppose you have to take that risk. Clearly, if you don't protect it, there's the risk that someone will copy it. If you do protect it, there's the risk that someone will copy it. If you send your patent to the Brazilian patent office, someone will just make it because they use that as a fairly suppliable input of where to get design drawings from. That's not really the idea of IP protection, but that's what goes on. So you have to think about that. And then the other thing, I suppose, again, you have to work out, are you really prepared to spend the money to protect that IP if someone decides to come along and go against it? So clearly it's important. Universities are really, really keen on IP. And as an HTC and a trust, we have a very simple agreement. And we rely on the fact we assume the majority of the background IP will be registered with you as the designer, developer, and manufacturer. What we say is, should there be some additional IP that comes out of the clinical world working with us, we'll have a sensible discussion about how to share any income from that. And that seems to work very well as a sensible agreement. Some other institutions just want your IP. You're not going to give them your IP. You spend all your hard-earned money developing it. You're not going to give it to someone. But people do expect you to do that. I'd like to encourage you to think about prototyping at an early stage. It's clearly become much, much easier, and clearly the advent of 3D printing, there are new 3D printing systems out there, so-called extraction printing, that are very fast, they're currently very expensive. And the great attraction of this is you can produce something that actually looks like what you want to use. Now you may think, surely we don't use electric drills, but orthopedic surgeons do, I can assure you. Orthopedic surgeons use electric drills. And I think the attraction, again, I'm pushing slightly the usability side of things, is that if you produce a prototype, it may cost you £200 to produce a 3D printed prototype, but if you then give it to the person that's really going to use it and say, can you use this with a pair of gloves on? So we've been looking at some technology, I'm not going to say what it is, which is very easy to use in your hands like this, but as soon as you put a pair of surgical gloves on, it's extremely difficult to get the buttons to work. There are capacitance systems that will work through rubber gloves, but many of them won't. So if you're going to use it in theatre and you're going to sterilise it, can you use it with a pair of gloves on? It sounds blindingly obvious, but you'd be surprised how much technology gets well down the line, and we then find that we can't actually use it or clean it. So I would encourage you to think about producing prototypes and think about giving them to the people that are actually going to use it and getting proper feedback. Some of you will be experts in this. I appreciate that. And I'm not, although I did spend 10 years with the NIHR working on the medical device side, so I have a working knowledge of the device regulations. You'd be amazed how few people do. If you go and speak to doctors about CE marking, they just assume you're talking about children's toys. Many have little idea. Surgeons are particularly worrying about their lack of understanding that there is actually a regulatory process out there, and that actually just manufacturing something in your shed and sticking it in a kettle and then using it on patients, that doesn't happen anymore. It used to happen all the time. But there is this concept that you can have a bit of a go before you need to actually get to in the regulations. And an anomaly in Europe is we don't have an equivalent of the IDE exemption, the investigational device exemption that the FDA has. So in the FDA, you can go locally and get approval from a local ethics committee to undertake a non-invasive investigation. That doesn't actually happen in Europe. It's one of the attractions, again, of using plastic patients to try things out on early on. CE marking, again, will be very familiar to many of you. Most of my colleagues think it applies to power supplies and toys, and of course it applies to everything that's defined as a medical device. I could give you another half-hour talk on is your app a device or not, and that's a particularly interesting question. And if you're interested in that, the MHRA have published some quite good guidelines about is your software a device or not. And increasingly, software is becoming a medical device and has to go through the CE marking. The thing I really like is that there are 150, the CE mark is absolutely defined as to how it shall be drawn. It's made out of two circles. One is cut in half, the other one's cut in half and has a little bar across the middle. So it's absolutely designed exactly what shape it will be. There are 150 recorded counterfeit CE marks that are the wrong shape. You would think if you were going to make counterfeit, and I have to say a lot of them have come out of the Far East, if you were going to counterfeit something, you at least get the CE mark right. So it's extraordinary how little attention people pay to it. And there are duff devices out there, and there are duff medical technology, but they're quite rare. Another confusion, again, not so much for you, but particularly amongst patients and also amongst staff, is this confusion over British standards and the kite mark. And that's not a regulatory process. That's a manufacturing standard. It's not a regulatory process, and has largely died out in the medical device world. I said, you've seen this slide before, there's a huge range of different devices. The majority of them would be in a class 1. There's class 1 measurement, class 1M, and class 1 sterile, which again are handled slightly differently. Then 2A, 2B, and 3, active implantable in vitro diagnostics. And the path through the regulations is very dependent upon which class of medical device you're in. Don't try and read all of this, because there's quite a lot of it, but this is a surgical tool that we designed for scraping bugs out the inside of your femur. And it's a class 1 medical device. It's a surgical tool. Although it is sterilized to use, it is not provided sterile. So therefore it's a class 1, not a class 1S. Now a really good trivial pursuit question is how do you know if a medical device is a class 1? The answer is there's no number after the CE mark. So the number after the CE mark is the number of the notified body, which I'll talk to you in a minute to. And you will see the same number in a lift, because the same notified body has certified the lift as has certified your pacemaker. So you'll see CE 029 or whatever, and that's the number of the notified body. Class 1 devices, unless they're sterile or have a measurement function, do not go through a notified body. But of course, when you get into more complex medical devices, then there's an additional step. So the majority of manufacturers will self-certify class 1 devices. It's easier to do that if you're ISO 13485 approved. You don't have to be. If you're not, it's probably better to link up with someone who is, because that's the easier route to go through. As soon as you come into 1S, 1M, 2 or 3, then you have to start having another body to tell you that it's all right to apply the CE mark. And if you look just at the right-hand side, of the left-hand side of this image, then you can see that this notified body plays a crucial part. They will revise your technical file and advise you and say, yes, we agree you can apply the CE mark. Perhaps also of interest that the competent authority, which in England and Wales would be the MHRA, is not involved in that process. The MHRA is only involved under two circumstances. One is if you wish to do a clinical investigation, which is a clinical study on a medical device that is not CE marked for the purposes of CE marking, the MHRA have to issue a letter of no objection for that study. The other time they'd get involved is there's a problem. So all the adverse incidents go back to the MHRA, and as a device manufacturer, if you have a serious adverse incident with potential life-threatening, you are legally required in the United Kingdom to report that. It's not completely true across the rest of Europe, but it is in the UK. These I am not say very much about. There are lots of them. There are 4 or 5 of them. You can go to any one in Europe as it currently stands, and I'll mention a little bit about why that might change. But at the moment, you can go anywhere in Europe to get one of these. They don't all do medical devices. Only about 23 of the 90 odd or so do medical devices. They are definitely for profit. They definitely compete on price. And you want to go to one that understands what you're trying to do. And they don't always. You also want to go to one that understands the FDA regulatory process, because much of the work that you will do in your laboratory, your workshop, or clinically can be used for both regulatory processes, and it's silly to have to repeat it. This is the Human Factors Device Usability Standard. It's actually been out for a few years now, but most people have just ignored it. So it's quite a well-written standard. It's quite complex. It's like most standards. It's about 135 pages long. But if you look at it, what it says is that devices, medical devices, should be used by real clinical staff in a realistic environment, but not on real patients. And that's what we've developed our centre to do. So at the moment, you don't have to comply with this standard to get your devices CE marked or indeed 510K FDA or PMA FDA approved. But it helps. It also helps you make a device that's going to be successful. So each year there are just over 14,000 adverse incidents reported to the MHRA around medical devices. Of that 14,000, 1/3 are definitely device related. It's broken, it's gone wrong. Only 1/3. Another 1/3 is definitely user or institutional error, and the other 1/3 is unknown. And I promise you in that unknown, there's a lot of user error built into that. We're very good at reporting. If you leant back and the steering wheel came off in your car, you wouldn't half ring out the garage, would you? But if you're a bit dozy and you didn't see the car in front had stopped and you ran into it, you're probably not going to ring up the garage and say, there's something wrong with my car, it ran into the car in front. And so we're bad at reporting usability. But there's very clear evidence that usability is a major concern in around safety of devices, and it's beginning to be built into regulatory pathways. Great, you've got it CE marked. Presumably now you just stick it in a van and sell it to the hospitals. Sadly, that's not the case. So CE marking, a cynical way of looking at it, CE marking means you can sell it. It does not mean we have to buy it. And this is changing all the time. None of us can afford the healthcare we'd like. Most of us can't afford the healthcare we've got. And I have to say that the healthcare funders are increasingly looking for reasons not to pay for things as they are looking for reasons to pay for what they've already got. And it does hamper the uptake of technology. Now, the NHS, of course, is a simple organisation. So selling into the NHS couldn't really be easier. No, wrong. So every single trust has its own purchasing policies. There are lists. The whole thing is very complex. It's not impossible, but it's complex, and you need help to navigate it. So what about getting guidance from a national body? All European countries have a health technology assessment board. NICE is a very unusual health technology assessment board because it does not have the payers, it doesn't have the commissioners on the committees and on the team. What NICE does is to say it'll only look at CE marked devices. There's no point going to them pre-CE marking. They'll just say, nope, not going to look at it. That means that they've already got some level of safety around the device before they look at it. They will look mainly at post-market clinical follow-up studies. They will look at registries if they're published. They will only look at peer-reviewed published evidence. So all of your internal reports, everything that you do internally, we won't look at. We will for safety, but not for efficacy. So again, you want to start working with people that will publish your results as early as possible so that you can use that evidence to make your application through bodies like NICE. The two main programs involved in technology are interventional procedures, which I chair, which look solely at safety and efficacy and does not consider cost at all. And then there's medical technology guidance, which does look at cost, but it only looks at cost-neutral or cost-saving technology. If you have a more expensive but more effective technology, you'd need to go to technology appraisal, which doesn't really do devices very well. So although I work for them, they're a great bunch to work for, there's undoubtedly more work to do within that organisation to start looking at technology. I cannot stress enough that we have to innovate to move forward in medicine. We have to do it. We're very bad at taking up new technology. We have to do it. There's a huge need to do it for ourselves and for our patients and for our children. I think it often is as complicated as it seems. So I don't want you to go away thinking it's easy. It's not easy, but it's definitely doable. And people do it every day. And we use new stuff every day, just not quickly enough. I don't think as a small company you can do it without help. Come and speak to your users early. Speak to people that have a professional understanding of what you need to do. Come and talk to us early about things so we can help you not to make very expensive mistakes. I don't know. Okay? It would be daft to introduce a set of medical device regulations that are ignored by Europe and ignored by the rest of the world. We export 80% of the devices that we manufacture. We import 80% of the devices that we use. It's an interesting, they're not the same. So we don't send one thing over to the States and import the same thing back again. But we export about 80% of what we make and import 80% of what we use. So we must have a regulatory process. We must have a regulatory process which is acceptable across Europe. It'd be great if it was acceptable in North America, but I doubt it. So we must have something that's usable in Europe. It would be daft not to. There is the opportunity of allowing us to do medical device research with less overhead and more cheaply in the UK than at the moment it is in Europe, because we can get rid of some of the administrative layers. Thank you very much indeed.